There are stories that history records, and others it quietly removes. Between the cracks of old maps and the walls of forgotten cities lies a world once called Tartaria, a civilization said to have spanned continents, its name erased not by war but by revision. Its traces remain scattered in architecture, buried foundations, and technologies that appear too advanced for their time. In the silence that followed its disappearance, new empires rose, claiming invention over inheritance. Yet the ruins still speak, star-shaped fortresses that mirror one another across oceans, domes that hum with unseen energy, and streets built over older streets, layer upon layer. This is not a story of conspiracy or conquest, but of memory of a world rebuilt to forget what came before. Tonight, we open that silence and follow the faint echoes of a civilization the world was never meant to remember. The forgotten maps. In archives across Europe, there exist maps that no one explains. They bear the name Tartaria, spread across a vast expanse that once covered most of northern Asia. Some editions from the 16th to the 18th centuries show it reaching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, touching the northern borders of India and China and brushing against what is now Siberia. The word appears in atlases printed in Amsterdam, Paris, and London. Gerardus Mercator included it in his 1595 Atlassiv Cosmographicae Meditatione de Fabrica Mundi, labelling it simply as Tartaria Magna. Later, in the 1733 edition of Guillaume de Lisle's maps, Great Tartary still occupied the same space. Then, after the mid-1800s, it was gone. Historians claim that Tartaria was not a nation, but a geographic term used by Europeans who knew little about the interior of Asia. They point to the nomadic tribes of the Mongol steppes, Tatars, Turks, and Siberian peoples as the likely inspiration for the word. Yet, the precision and scale of the name across so many cartographic sources leave a lingering unease. Maps are political tools. They record what is known and erase what is no longer permitted to exist. By the 19th century, as the Russian Empire consolidated its hold over Central Asia and Siberia, Tartaria vanished from print, replaced by new provincial borders and administrative names aligned with imperial authority. Old books describe Tartars not as a single people, but as many nations bound by a mysterious northern culture. The 1670 English world map by John Speed notes Tartary with cities, rivers, and even borders, as though it were an empire with governance and trade. The Jesuit missionary Nicolaas Whitson, writing in Noord- en Oost-Tartary, 1692, spoke of walled towns and complex waterways stretching through the unknown lands of Siberia. He wrote of ruins, metal relics, and scripts carved into stones that no one could translate. His accounts were later dismissed as exaggeration. Across archives, scattered mentions connect Tartaria to strange architectural remains, vast structures found from Turkestan to Mongolia that defied easy explanation. In the late 18th century, travellers like Peter Simon Pallas recorded stone fortresses older than any Russian settlement, and columns inscribed with unfamiliar letters. Others noted buildings partially buried beneath soil layers, their lower floors filled with mud and debris, suggesting catastrophic flooding. These fragments fed later speculation about a lost empire, wiped not by conquest, but by a natural or deliberate reset. The story of Tartaria begins to blur, where archaeology, mythology, and suppressed record meet. In 1812, the British traveller Edward Daniel Clarke observed the ruins of a massive brick city near Tobolsk and wrote that it appeared too ancient for the Tartars and too advanced for any Siberian tribe. He described domes, arches, and walls resembling Islamic and Byzantine styles, yet isolated in a region supposedly devoid of architecture before Russian colonization. His notes received little attention in London, overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars. There were also reports of advanced infrastructure that appeared mismatched with the time period. Engineers working along the Trans-Siberian route in the late 19th century discovered buried foundations of what they thought were aqueducts and tunnels of unknown origin. In 1893, a report in the Proceedings of the Russian Imperial Technical Society mentioned metallic pipes found deep in permafrost near Yakutsk. They were sealed, smooth, and of alloy composition not consistent with known 19th century manufacture. No follow-up investigation was published. In art and legend, Tartaria survived longer than in maps. Paintings of oriental courts in St. Petersburg and Paris depicted golden-roofed palaces, wide domes, and mechanical fountains. A French volume, printed in 1786, described the kingdom of the Tartars as a land of great machines, towers with lightning conductors, and lights that burned without flame. These lines were likely poetic, yet they mirror an older fascination with lost technologies. The phrase mud flood appeared in the 20th century to describe theories that many 18th and 19th century buildings were not new constructions, but excavation structures unearthed from earlier layers. Photographs from St. Petersburg, Moscow, and even San Francisco show lower windows buried below street level, their doors recessed under modern ground lines. Historians explain this as the result of urban reconstruction, sediment buildup, or fires. Others suspect a deliberate concealment, a reset of civilization after a cataclysm that erased an entire world culture. Electric-style towers, star-shaped fortresses, and buildings aligned to geomagnetic points all add to the puzzle. In Kazan, Astrakhan, and Omsk, 18th century plans reveal star-shaped citadels identical to designs found in Venice and Antwerp, suggesting an architectural code shared across continents. No records describe who first conceived this geometry or why it followed similar patterns in Asia and Europe. The same design radiating bastions around a central core appears in the fort of Delhi, the citadel of Novgorod, and even the coastal forts of Havana. These links are often dismissed as coincidence, yet they indicate a forgotten school of engineering that understood energy, magnetism, and defense in ways the surviving records no longer explain. Some references go further, connecting Tartaria to the legend of free energy systems. Drawings of atmospheric antennas atop old domes and spires appear in 18th century engravings. Observers like Augustin Hauch, in his 1798 Architectura Mirabilis, described metal globes atop towers which gather the vital spark of heaven. Later, such devices were said to be decorative. The official record of technology in that age does not acknowledge any distributed electrical network. Still, across many older cities, domed rooftops and antenna-like ornaments appear far more functional than aesthetic. In China's north, near Harbin, explorers in the 1932 reported discovering stone reliefs showing what looked like airships or mechanical craft. Photographs were taken but lost during the Second World War. One surviving sketch in a Japanese archaeological journal from 1937 refers to them as sky carts of the Tartars. Whether the name was chosen for poetic effect or drawn from local folklore is unknown. The mystery of Tartaria often intertwines with that of erased events. Fires that consumed entire cities, the Great Fire of Moscow in 1812, the Chicago Fire of 1871, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 are cited as moments when old worlds were physically buried and new ones constructed atop them. Catalogues of early photographs show empty streets, grand architecture, and almost no people. Some historians interpret this as the beginning of modernity. Others, quietly, wonder if it was a reconstruction of an older infrastructure left behind by an erased civilization. In 1837, the Russian historian Nikolai Karamzin remarked that history begins where memory ends. His phrase would echo centuries later in discussions of Tartaria, suggesting that what disappears from maps may not vanish from the world itself, only from permission to remember. The Great Reset hypothesis. In the mid-19th century, something changed in the world's cities that remains difficult to explain. Old architecture was buried, entire populations were displaced, and new systems of power and measurement were introduced almost simultaneously across continents. Historians describe this period as the Industrial Revolution, a time of progress, steam, and invention. Yet, scattered fragments suggest it may have also been an era of erasure. Between 1815 and 1875, fires and floods consumed dozens of urban centers: Moscow, Paris, Chicago, San Francisco, Toronto, and Constantinople. Streets were rebuilt with uncanny speed, often upon layers of buried stone and half-submerged structures. In some cases, excavations uncovered doorways and windows beneath ground level, as if the surface of the earth had risen by several meters. Engineers of the time recorded their findings, but newspapers quickly reclassified these anomalies as basement levels created for storage. The pattern appeared everywhere. In St. Petersburg, early photographs from the 1852 show palaces and public buildings with lower arches half buried in mud. The city's builders under Peter the Great's orders in the early 1700s had reportedly constructed these edifices on solid marshland. Yet, within a century, many of their lower floors had vanished beneath compacted soil. In San Francisco, photographs taken after the 1906 earthquake reveal similarly submerged ground floors, consistent with what would later be called the mud flood. The Great Reset theory, whispered in alternative circles, suggests that these were not natural disasters or gradual sedimentation, but the aftermath of a global event, perhaps electrical, geological, or even atmospheric. According to this view, an advanced civilization, possibly the one labelled Tartaria, experienced a sudden collapse. The survivors, or those who inherited the ruins, repurposed the technology and claimed credit for its creation, beginning the modern historical narrative around 1850. Some researchers point to the World's Fairs as evidence of this rewriting. The Great Exhibition of 1851 inches London, the Exposition Universelle in Paris, 1867, 1878, 1889, and the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 displayed monumental buildings said to be temporary constructions of plaster and wood. Yet, photographs show stone-like materials, detailed carvings, and structures of immense scale that were later demolished with surprising haste. The White City of Chicago, spanning over 600 acres, contained domes, columns, and facades that resembled ancient temples more than Victorian inventions. Within months of the exposition's closure, most of it was dismantled or destroyed by fire. Contemporary accounts speak of these exhibitions as showcases of progress, but others saw them as something else, an unveiling of already existing architecture, dressed in new symbols, then conveniently erased. The architectural style called Beaux-Arts, used in these fairs, appears without clear evolutionary roots, emerging fully formed across the Western world between 1870 and 1910. It bore remarkable resemblance to the supposed imperial buildings of Tartaria: symmetry, grand domes, geometric layouts, and star-shaped foundations. Electricity is another recurring theme. In photographs from the 1880, lampposts and towers appear wired before the widespread adoption of electrical grids. Some of these structures, such as the iron Wardenclyffe-like spires of exposition halls, were rumoured to operate on atmospheric electricity, an idea Nikola Tesla would later explore in the 1892. The timing is curious. Technology that appeared advanced even for the 20th century seems to have emerged from nowhere within decades of the alleged reset. Chronology itself began to shift. In the 19th century, nations standardized time zones, calendars, and historical dating systems. The year 1850 marks a dividing line in record keeping. Before it, archives grow inconsistent, filled with vague references and lost manuscripts. After it, the printing of encyclopedias, census data, and photography becomes uniform. It is as if the world synchronized to a single clock, erasing older time frames that did not align with the new order. In Russia, the historian Pyotr Kropotkin wrote in 1883 that entire towns across Siberia appeared as if built upon older foundations. He described cellars filled with debris, streets misaligned with the terrain, and artifacts that do not belong to the people who now dwell here. His letters were archived in Geneva and largely ignored. Around the same period, the Jesuit explorer Évariste Regis-Houcq described in northern China vast deserted cities whose walls are too wide for any present population. The theory of a Great Reset also aligns with the sudden disappearance of certain technologies. Atmospheric energy devices, pneumatic tube systems, and early electric motors were documented in the 1800s, only to vanish from practical use. By the 20th century, industrial power had shifted towards centralized production coal, oil, and combustion engines. The idea of drawing power from the air was quietly removed from scientific discourse. Some point to photographs of 19th century disasters, dust-covered cities, strange lightning storms, and accounts of skies filled with static as indicators of an atmospheric disturbance. The Carrington event of 1859, a massive solar storm that disrupted telegraph systems worldwide, is sometimes cited as a trigger. In letters archived by the Royal Society, telegraph operators reported sparks leaping from their instruments even when disconnected. If an energy-based civilization had existed, such an event could have shorted it beyond recovery. The narrative of industrial progress replaced the memory of global collapse. Between 1850 and 1900, new histories were written, old maps redrawn, and schools began teaching a simplified version of world chronology. The concept of ancient became confined to Egypt, Greece, and Rome, cultures comfortably distant, their ruins static. The fluid, interconnected network once labelled Tartaria was forgotten, replaced by nations and empires that claim descent from themselves. In hidden corners of old libraries, however, anomalies persist. A book printed in 1781 by Johann Bernoulli mentions Tartar cities lit by a natural fire of the heavens. Another, from 1802, describes the star fortresses of Siberia as centers of magnetic defense. Neither text appears in modern bibliographies. In 1912, the Imperial Archaeological Commission of Russia catalogued a set of bronze gears found near Lake Baikal. The report was filed, stamped no historical significance, and never translated. The term reset may have begun as metaphor, but now suggests something literal, an alteration not only of civilization, but of collective memory. The gaps between documented events, the vanishing of entire architectural eras, and the sudden standardization of time all imply a moment when the world's record was rewritten, perhaps intentionally. Even now, beneath many cities, the lower windows remain buried, the old arches sealed. When construction crews dig deep enough, they sometimes find doorways that open into nothing but packed earth. The layers tell no stories, only silence hardened by centuries. The star fort network. Across continents, an architectural pattern repeats with quiet precision. Massive geometric citadels, shaped like stars, each with radiating bastions and moats, dot the landscapes of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Historians call them star forts, a style said to have originated in Renaissance Italy under the design principles of military engineers, such as Michelangelo Buonarroti and Francesco di Giorgio Martini. Yet, these same patterns appear in regions untouched by Italian influence, built centuries before European expansion reached them. Their uniformity suggests something beyond coincidence, an architectural code that once spanned the world. In 1597, the Dutch engineer Simon Steven wrote about fortificatiekunde, the science of fortification, describing the star design as born of mathematics and the angle of defense. By that period, European engineers were building citadels like Palmanova in Italy, an entire city laid out as a perfect nine-pointed star constructed by the Venetian Republic, but nearly identical patterns appear far from the Mediterranean. In India, the fort of Diu, completed in the mid-1500s, shares the same geometry. In Japan, Goryokaku Fortress, built in 1855, mirrors European star design even before any formal Western architectural exchange occurred. Satellite imagery reveals the sheer scale of this network. Fort Bortange in the Netherlands, Fort McHenry in the United States, and the citadel of Erbil in Iraq display strikingly similar angles, proportions, and layouts. Some are positioned on coastlines, others inland, and many align precisely with magnetic north. Their ditches and moats form layered hexagrams and octagons, shapes that, in later interpretations, resemble electrical circuits. The purpose of such perfection remains uncertain. Military historians argue for improved defense against cannon fire. Yet some forts exist in regions that never saw artillery combat. The mystery deepens when examining older structures. Near the Caspian Sea, aerial photographs show eroded outlines of polygonal enclosures buried under sediment. These predate known fortifications and lack any recorded builders. Russian surveyor Dmitry Zavoyko, in his 1864 expedition report, described ancient ramparts arranged as a star, immense and silent, as though built for something other than war. His notes were archived under unexplained ruins, eastern Tartary. Many researchers who study the lost empire of Tartaria believe these star forts were not military at all, but part of a global system, possibly for energy distribution or atmospheric collection. They point to the conductive materials once used in their bastions: brick mixed with crushed quartz, iron filings, and clay. In 1783, engineer François de Vauban recorded that his star fort designs required breathing wells beneath each bastion, open shafts leading into underground chambers. He described them as for ventilation. But others see potential evidence of an older function, perhaps related to air pressure or resonance. The alignment of forts also follows curious patterns. In France, Spain, and northern Africa, many are positioned along what geographers later identified as ley lines, imaginary lines connecting ancient monuments, cathedrals, and megaliths. From Palmanova to Gibraltar, from Malta to Cairo, several star forts trace near-perfect meridians. When overlaid with early global maps of Tartaria, their placement forms a continuous arc stretching into Central Asia. Some enthusiasts call this the star grid, suggesting an interconnected infrastructure whose purpose predates recorded history. One striking feature unites almost all of them: symmetry. Regardless of terrain, builders maintained precise angular ratios, often exact multiples of 11.25 degrees. Modern engineers, remeasuring these ruins, found deviations of less than 1%, impossible without advanced surveying instruments. In 1760, during reconstruction of the Kronstadt fortress near St. Petersburg, architects uncovered copper rods driven deep into the earth beneath its bastions. The rods did not connect to walls or weapon mounts. They simply vanished downward. Their function was never explained. when the Great Reset hypothesis is applied, the star forts become more than military relics. They become remnants of an older, possibly global network. Their disappearance from architectural use around the mid-19th century aligns with the broader erasure of Tartarian structures. Many were buried or repurposed as parks, prisons, or city centres. Palma Nova became a Venetian suburb. Fort Wood in New York was converted into the base for the Statue of Liberty. The transformation appears less like decay and more like disguise. Descriptions from early travellers add to the enigma. The English explorer Thomas Jenkinson, journeying through Astrakhan in 1558, noted polygonal earthworks, whose design no man could claim, for they predate even the Tartars. In the 1,830 seconds, American surveyor William Duane mapped a similar formation near Street Augustine, Florida. He wrote, "The angles are too true for Indian or Spanish art. It must be older, by whom or why I cannot tell." His map was filed without classification. Some theories suggest these star forts once harnessed or modulated natural currents of the Earth's electromagnetic fields, converted into light or heat. Observers point to the iron-capped spires and domes that once adorned many of them, often linked by copper wiring or subterranean tunnels. In 1901, Russian archaeologist Vladimir Bogdanov unearthed such wiring beneath the Omsk fortress and speculated that it may have served for lightning collection. His report never mentioned warfare. Even more curious is their uniform elevation. Whether in sea-level cities or mountain valleys, star forts sit at nearly identical altitudes relative to the mean sea level of their regions, as if chosen for harmonic balance. The fortress of Goa in India, for example, shares the same relative height as the citadel of Lille in France, and the fortifications of Quebec in Canada, differences measured within mere meters. Such precision could hardly be accidental across such distances and eras. By the late 19th century, the pattern ceased. Forts built after 1870 adopted linear or circular forms, and the intricate geometry vanished from design manuals. The art of star construction disappeared almost overnight. Manuals of fortification from the 1,880 seconds, such as Cours de Construction de Forts by Colonel Jules Fevre, no longer mention multi-bastion symmetry. The age of angular defence had ended, as if its true purpose had been forgotten or deliberately removed. Today, when seen from the air, these remnants resemble snowflakes of stone-silent patterns pressed into the earth. Each one bears the mark of advanced geometry, material knowledge, and intent. Yet none are attributed to Tartaria by official record. They belong to no empire, no single era, and no clear architect. In the words of the 19th century Russian geographer Pyotr Semyonov-Tyenshansky, "The earth remembers what our books do not." His note, found in his unpublished field diary from 1868, referred to the great walls beneath our fields and fortresses built by hands whose names are gone. Whether he spoke of the Tartars or of something far older remains uncertain. The architecture that shouldn't exist. In cities across the world, there are buildings that seem too advanced for the time in which they were supposedly built. Cathedrals carved with microscopic precision, domes heavier than entire ships, and stone blocks shaped with techniques that modern engineers cannot easily reproduce. They stand as monuments to something forgotten works of mastery attributed to stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans, who, according to written history, had neither electricity, mechanized tools, nor reinforced concrete. These structures appear suddenly in the 18th and 19th centuries, fully formed, as though built by a civilization that did not have to learn, only to remember. In St. Petersburg, the Kazan Cathedral, completed in 1811, rises with 96 Corinthian columns of polished stone. Each weighs more than 30 tons, yet records show only hand tools and oxen used in their assembly. The same years saw the construction of St. Isaac's Cathedral, which contains a dome plated with 100 kilograms of gold leaf and resting on walls of granite weighing over 300,000 tons. The engineering required hydraulic presses, cranes, and scaffolding that did not exist in early 1800s Russia. Even official documents admit that many of the tools used in its raising appeared from foreign inventors, yet no names or patents survive. In Paris, the Pantheon stands as another enigma. It was completed in 1790, before the Industrial Revolution had brought heavy machinery to architecture. The interior dome aligns perfectly with its outer shell, a feat requiring modern optical instruments for measurement. Builders claim to use pendulums and mirrors to achieve symmetry. The explanation feels incomplete. The same precision appears in structures across continents. The Capitol building in Washington, the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City, and the Cathedral of Granada in Nicaragua, all with domes of near identical ratios, completed within decades of each other. The repetition of this advanced geometry across nations suggests shared blueprints or a common architectural language now missing from the record. When compared, the ratios of width to height and dome to column spacing follow the same proportion known as the divine ratio 1:618. This ratio was understood in ancient times, but its exact mathematical control at the scale of multi-ton stone construction would have required more than intuition. Engineers of the 19th century left few explanations, as if they were imitating something older rather than inventing anew. The mystery deepens when examining what lies below street level. In photographs from the 1,860 seconds taken during roadworks in Petersburg, Berlin, and Chicago, excavations reveal windows, arches, and entire lower stories buried beneath layers of soil. Doors open into earth. Historians call them basements, but the scale and ornamentation suggest otherwise. Entrances once meant to face open air. In some cases, the buried levels contain soot marks on ceilings and walls, as if fires once burned there. This recurring pattern feeds into the theory of a worldwide catastrophe, a reset that buried older structures, later reinterpreted as new. Accounts from the time reflect uncertainty. In 1852, the architect Auguste de Montferrand wrote that St. Isaac's Cathedral stands upon the ruins of something far older, whose stones yet whisper beneath. His remark was not widely published. In 1891, American builder George B. Post described excavating a foundation in Lower Manhattan where the brick was too hard to cut and too ancient to date. He noted the stone resembled the type used in Roman construction, but no Roman settlements existed in North America. Perhaps the most striking example of impossible architecture lies in the phenomenon of the exhibition palaces. Structures like the Crystal Palace of London, 1851, the Machinery Hall of Philadelphia, 1876, and the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building in Chicago, 1893, were said to be temporary, yet photographs reveal stone columns, metal domes, and masonry finishes indistinguishable from permanent edifices. Some of these buildings covered dozens of acres and were demolished only months after completion. The official explanation was fragility, that they were made of plaster and wood. But demolition reports describe dynamite, not decay. Inside these palaces were machines, generators, and devices of unknown origin. The Paris Exposition of 1,889 featured lamps, powered by wireless energy, long before Tesla's experiment. Visitors wrote of light without heat and air charged with vitality. Some devices on display were never patented and were dismantled after the fairs closed. The blueprints are missing, as if their creators never existed. In the 1,820 seconds, a French publication titled Le Magasin Pittoresque described palaces of Tartarian make, adorned with metallic domes that draw light from the air. The description predates the Electric Age by decades. The resemblance between these accounts and later expositions raises the question of whether the industrial fairs were not celebrations of invention, but exhibitions of rediscovered relics, old designs reintroduced under new names. Another architectural anomaly lies in material composition. Analyses of 18th century masonry in Eastern Europe have revealed lime-based concretes with properties similar to modern Portland cement, a formulation officially invented only in 1824. Tests conducted in 1979 on mortar samples from St. Petersburg's Admiralty Building found traces of silicon dioxide and aluminum oxide, elements associated with high-temperature processing. Such temperatures would require furnaces far beyond the capability of early 19th century industry. Some architects of the period seemed aware of the paradox. In 1836, the Russian academic Mikhail Lomonosov noted that "we are building anew, yet not knowing what we imitate." His phrase appears in a letter preserved in the archives of the Russian Academy of Sciences. A similar sentiment was recorded by Charles Garnier, designer of the Paris Opera House, who admitted that our ancestors had methods we can only wonder at. If the Great Reset truly occurred, these impossible buildings might be fragments of what survived structures too durable to destroy, rebranded as modern achievements. Their uniformity across continents suggests centralized knowledge, erased from collective memory. After 1900, the architectural style changed abruptly. Ornamentation faded, facades flattened, and concrete replaced stone. The old world disappeared beneath a new aesthetic of function and simplicity, as if the age of grandeur had been intentionally closed. Even today, restoration experts marvel at the precision of 18th century architecture. The stones of the Hermitage align so tightly that a sheet of paper cannot pass between them. The domes of Florence and St. Petersburg maintain perfect curvature after centuries of frost and war. When asked how such symmetry was achieved without machines, historians reply with silence, or with phrases like "lost technique" or "extraordinary craftsmanship." But records of those techniques never existed in the first place. These buildings remain solid, indifferent, and mute. They defy the official timeline, yet define the skylines of the modern age. Whatever hands built them did so with knowledge no longer taught, perhaps belonging to a civilization that ended not in fire, but in forgetting. The evidence beneath the cities. Across the world's oldest cities, the ground tells a quiet story. Beneath modern streets lie older ones, sealed in darkness. Entire rooms, stairways, and arches rest under the soil, preserved by sediment or deliberately filled. Archaeologists call these substructures, layers built upon by successive generations. But their scale and alignment often do not fit the official narrative of gradual development. In some cases, the buried layers appear more advanced, with masonry of higher precision than what lies above them. The deeper one looks, the more the city begins to resemble a palimpsest, the remnants of a civilization written over by another. In St. Petersburg, construction workers during the 1952nd subway project uncovered bricked archways 20 feet below the surface. The passages led nowhere, their ceilings blackened with soot, their floors paved with smooth granite. They were officially classified as old cellars, yet their symmetry mirrored the streets above. A similar discovery occurred in Paris during the expansion of the metro line in 1904. Crews reported ornate archways, plastered walls, and carved lintels 10 meters beneath Haussmann's boulevards. The findings were documented in city records, but sealed for safety reasons. In Edinburgh, under the Royal Mile, the vaults discovered in the 1980 seconds revealed entire neighbourhoods buried under centuries of construction. Streets complete with shop fronts, windows, and cobblestones stretched beneath the modern city. Historians attribute this to the medieval practice of building atop older foundations. Yet the craftsmanship of these substructures, cut sandstone blocks, decorative lintels, and drainage systems suggests advanced engineering for the period. San Francisco provides one of the most striking examples. Photographs from the early 1900s, taken after the earthquake, show buildings with windows at street level, later covered by rising pavements. Today, if one removes the asphalt, those windows open into what were once main floors. In some downtown areas, the original streets lie more than 12 feet below the current surface. Local guides explain this as an effect of post-earthquake regrading. But older photographs from the 1,850 seconds already show partially buried facades, long before the disaster. The same pattern appears in Turin, Amsterdam, and Prague. Windows and doors half submerged, steps descending into earth, streets aligned with something older beneath. Engineers tasked with maintenance sometimes describe hearing hollow echoes below, as if walking above vast chambers. In 1895, during sewer construction in Warsaw, workers discovered bronze lamp fixtures embedded in ancient mortar far below recorded building levels. Their origin was never explained, but one was displayed briefly at the Polish Museum of Technology before disappearing during the Second World War. Some researchers connect these findings to the so-called mud flood, the idea that a global event in the 18th or 19th century deposited thick layers of mud across cities, burying an earlier world. Accounts from the time describe sudden deluges, landslides, and inexplicable ground shifts. A diary entry from Moscow dated 1816 notes, "After the storm, the streets were buried to the height of a man." In Istanbul, chroniclers recorded a similar event that same year, when the ground rose and the doors vanished beneath it. Modern geology attributes such descriptions to flooding and erosion, yet the simultaneous occurrence across continents raises questions. Excavations in London add another layer to the mystery. During the construction of the Underground, in the 1,860 seconds, engineers unearthed layers of fine silt containing pottery, brick fragments, and tools of unfamiliar design. Charles Pearson, one of the city planners, described finding arches as if belonging to an older London, perfect and sound. The material of these arches was not brick, but a vitrified stone similar to modern ceramic. Samples were taken but never analysed further. In 1928, during foundation work for a new building in Oklahoma City, workers encountered a perfectly smooth concrete floor 20 feet below the surface, predating known settlement in the area. The discovery made local news for a week before being dismissed as a natural formation. Yet the site foreman, John T. Reynolds, described the surface as harder than anything our drills could cut. He speculated it was artificial. Tunnels, too, appear beneath cities where no historical record predicts them. In Vienna, the catacombs beneath street. Stephen's Cathedral extend far beyond the documented crypts, branching into sealed corridors. In one section, walls bear soot streaks without any sign of human occupation. A similar pattern appears in the old quarter of Istanbul, where ground-penetrating radar reveals long rectangular chambers filled with sediment, each aligned in perfect grids. The Ottoman records make no mention of such structures. If Tartaria existed, these buried layers might represent what remained of its cities, the lower levels of a civilization, erased by catastrophe or by design. The uniform pattern of half-buried architecture across continents supports the idea of a global event, not isolated local floods. And in each case, the upper layers that replace them follow the same template: wide avenues, neoclassical facades, symmetrical domes. It is as if the world was rebuilt in imitation of what lay beneath, yet without understanding its purpose. In 1873, a Russian surveyor named Nikolai Frolov wrote of excavations in Kazan revealing columns of red granite, lamps still fixed in place, and stairways that led to sealed doors. He remarked that the design was unlike any known Tatar or Russian style. His report, published briefly in Zapiski Imperatorskogo Ruskogo Geograficheskogo Obshestva, disappeared in later editions. Even modern findings echo the same story. In 1998, during metro expansion in Samara, engineers unearthed a tunnel lined with bricks harder than steel. No one could date it accurately. The bricks contained a high proportion of quartz sand fused under heat. The chamber was resealed and the records archived as anomaly. Cities, by their nature, layer themselves over time, but these layers do not always align with history. Beneath our feet may lie an older world, silent and intact, waiting under centuries of soil. Each buried doorway, each sealed window, hints at continuity, the memory of a civilization that may never have vanished, only been covered. The forgotten technology of free energy. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, cities across the world displayed a peculiar architectural feature: tall metal spires, domes topped with orbs, and antenna-like rods that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Officially, these ornaments were decorative, inspired by religious and classical design, yet their consistent form and placement high above the largest cathedrals, government buildings, and train stations suggested function rather than aesthetics. When viewed together, they form a global pattern: conductive materials positioned precisely at the highest points of structures, often linked by metal chains or wires running invisibly beneath the surface. In older engineering manuals, faint traces of this idea remain. An 1804 German text titled Die himmlische Kraft, the heavenly force, describes devices which draw from the ether to power illumination. The author, identified only as J.H. Kruger, claimed that such energy was abundant in the firmament and could be captured through polished domes. No physical devices from this period survive, and most copies of the book were lost during the Napoleonic Wars. Still, its terminology Luftstromkraft, or air current power, appears decades before the word electricity became common in public discourse. Some historians attribute this to poetic metaphor, yet physical evidence persists. In St. Petersburg, photographs from the 1860 seconds showed dozens of buildings capped with large metallic domes connected to thin rods. Many of these spires vanished after the 1900s, replaced by simpler roofs. Similar domes existed in Istanbul, Vienna, and Chicago. On early maps of these cities, the alignment of major domes and towers forms geometric grids, sometimes connecting points along straight lines that stretch for miles. Nikola Tesla's research later revived these ideas under new names: radiant energy and wireless transmission. In 1892, he described the atmosphere as an immense reservoir of electrical charge. His Wardenclyffe Tower, built in 1901 on Long Island, followed principles suspiciously close to those already visible in centuries-old architecture: a conductive spire, a domed terminal, and a grounding system extending deep into the earth. When Tesla presented his findings to financiers, he noted, "The energy of the earth itself may be tapped as one taps a spring." The concept was revolutionary, yet it may have been rediscovery rather than invention. Reports from the mid-19th century mention unusual city lighting systems. In 1843, the French engineer Jacques Babinet wrote about the lamps of Lyon, which glowed with a constant bluish light and required no visible flame or oil. The devices, reportedly attached to metallic posts, were said to have functioned for decades before being removed during street renovations. The local archives contain no record of who installed them. In Philadelphia, newspaper clippings from 1852 describe light towers that illuminated entire blocks without gas or wiring. They disappeared without explanation in later years. Architectural engravings reveal more subtle clues. The so-called onion domes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia often contain an internal metallic lattice, something that would increase electrical conductivity. The golden domes of Moscow's Kremlin, coated in an alloy of copper and gold, could have acted as capacitors, collecting atmospheric charge. Beneath them run narrow shafts of stone and metal piping, now sealed. Historians describe these as ventilation systems, but their alignment straight downward to metallic grates and wells suggests possible grounding conduits. The World's Fairs again fit into this puzzle. The 1893 Chicago Exposition famously operated hundreds of electric lamps before any public power grid existed in the city. Engineers claimed to use generators on site, yet eyewitnesses noted that the lamps seemed to burn without visible fuel or wiring in certain sections. Some described them as arc lights that drew from the air. After the exposition closed, most of the equipment vanished. The official records list the machinery as removed for scrap, but inventories of that scrap have never been found. Researchers in the early 20th century revisited the mystery. The Russian physicist Alexander Chizevsky studied atmospheric ionization and its relation to human behavior, proposing that solar cycles affected electrical charge in the air. He discovered measurable energy differentials between the tops of domes and the ground. His experiments were later suppressed by Soviet authorities, and he was imprisoned during Stalin's purges. His notes mention old buildings designed for the capture of cosmic electricity. Even in the United States, remnants of these systems lingered. In 1903, a patent was filed by a man named Hermann Plausen for a method of utilizing atmospheric electricity. His device used a network of elevated conductors connected to storage cells, a simplified version of what Tesla had described. The patent's diagrams resemble the tower spires seen in engravings from centuries earlier. The existence of such technology would explain several peculiarities in older architecture, why many domes are plated in metals like copper, gold, or tin, why minarets and steeples are capped with spheres rather than crosses in earlier depictions, and why star forts, previously discussed, often contain central batteries or wells filled with metallic debris. Some claim these were not wells for water, but for grounding current. Accounts from travellers lend unexpected support. The Jesuit missionary Giuseppe Castiglione wrote from Beijing in 1748 that the temples of the north glow faintly at night, as though lit from within. He attributed it to reflected moonlight, but his description matches phosphorescent discharge sometimes produced by static buildup. In Siberia, explorer Yakov Rogozin recorded that locals spoke of singing domes that emitted a humming sound during storms. Modern scientists recognize this as corona discharge, an effect of high-voltage accumulation. If this was once a global system, an atmospheric network of energy harnessed through architecture, its erasure would explain the abrupt transition to fossil fuels and wired electricity in the 19th century. What had been free and decentralized became monetized and industrialized. The so-called Age of Progress may have been less an age of discovery than of substitution. The disappearance of this technology coincided with the rise of modern electrical monopolies. In 1882, Thomas Edison opened the first commercial power plant in New York. Within a few decades, governments began regulating private generation, restricting unlicensed electrical systems. Older spires and domes were grounded or removed altogether. Laws appeared requiring lightning rods on tall buildings, ironically, the very structures that once may have served that purpose in a more functional way. Today, traces remain. Copper spheres still crown old churches, forgotten grounding pits lie beneath their floors. In some places, Strange metallic hums are reported during heavy storms, vibrations within domes, long disconnected from any visible circuit. These may be echoes of an older design, still quietly functioning, gathering an energy we no longer recognize, whether it was symbolic, spiritual, or technological. The precision with which these architectural features were built implies knowledge of natural forces far beyond what history records. A civilization that mastered the invisible currents of the air could have powered its cities without smoke or sound. What remains of that knowledge sits hidden in stone and metal, mistaken for art, the disappearance from the record. Sometime during the middle of the 19th century, history itself began to change, not only through invention and war, but through the quiet rewriting of what had come before. Maps, books, and encyclopedias that once contained the word Tartaria were replaced, revised, or withdrawn. Architectural treatises that spoke of atmospheric energy, resonant geometry, or harmonic design stopped appearing in print. Museums reclassified artifacts, and newly formed academic institutions drew strict lines between myth, religion, and science. What once seemed interconnected became separated, catalogued under new disciplines that no longer spoke to each other. The disappearance was not sudden, but it was thorough. Early atlases provide the clearest example. In 1771, the French Atlas Moderne listed Grande Tartarie as one of the world's major divisions, alongside Europe, Asia, and Africa. By 1850, the same publisher issued a new edition, Asia Septentrionale, and the term was gone. British cartographers followed suit. John Carey's new Universal Atlas of 1,801 still labelled Chinese Tartary, yet its 1,836 revision renamed the region Northern China and Russian Siberia. The erasure was complete by the 1,862nd, just as the first standardized world histories began appearing in universities. One explanation offered by historians is that improved geographic knowledge rendered older terms obsolete. Yet the removal extended beyond maps. Descriptions of Tartarian peoples, technologies, and customs vanished from travelogues, and many original manuscripts became inaccessible. The archives of the Royal Geographical Society in London once held over 30 journals of explorers referencing the lands of the Tartars as independent or semi-organized states. Today, only fragments remain, many reclassified under Asian tribal accounts. A similar revision occurred in architecture. Manuals printed before 1850 often mention vital energies and etheric principles in design, words soon replaced by acoustics and aerodynamics. The 1823 edition of Manuale di Architettura Universale by Vincenzo Viviani includes diagrams of spires labelled conduttori atmospheric conductors. The 1871 reprint omits those pages entirely. A marginal note in the archives of the University of Padua states simply, "Not required under the new technical curriculum." Libraries underwent quiet transformations. When the British Museum reorganised its holdings in the 1882nd, dozens of pre-industrial manuscripts were transferred to non-relevant sections or sold to private collectors. Among them was a collection titled Relics of the Northern Empire, catalogued in 1847. The file's entry today reads, "Missing since 1892. The same occurred in St. Petersburg, where the Imperial Library underwent a purge of redundant ethnographic material during the reforms of Alexander II. Entire volumes describing Tartarian cities Ostiak, Tobolsk, Irkutsk were discarded or repurposed into new bindings. The academic shift was visible even in language. Between 1830 and 1870, the scientific vocabulary changed dramatically. Words such as ether, vitalism, and magnetism of the heavens were gradually replaced with electromagnetism and energy transfer. While this represented progress in understanding, it also closed the door to older frameworks that might have described the same phenomena differently. What could once be discussed in metaphysical or natural terms became confined to laboratory measurement. During this same period, the first encyclopedias of world history appeared. The 1853 Encyclopedia Metropolitana described Tartary as a vast and undefined tract known to ancient travellers, but by its 1875 revision, the entry was removed entirely. A note in the preface explained, "The modern distribution of empire renders previous designations unnecessary. The language is clinical, yet the result is erasure." Within 2 generations, the largest landmass ever named on European maps had vanished not by conquest, but by redescription. Art and literature underwent similar transformations. Before 1850, European painters often depicted vast oriental cities, domes, towers, and fortresses under pale northern skies, attributed to the Tartarian style. Afterward, these same scenes were relabeled as fantasies or Eastern Romanticism. The aesthetic that once mirrored actual geography was reinterpreted as imagination. Even musical works referencing Tartary, such as François-Adrien Bourdieu's 1809 Le Calife de Tartarie, disappeared from repertoires, dismissed as exotic relics. The disappearance extended into institutional control of knowledge. The rise of centralized academies, the Royal Society in London, the Académie des Sciences in Paris, and later the Smithsonian Institution in the United States created official hierarchies of evidence. They standardized what could be considered credible. Manuscripts lacking provenance or conflicting with the accepted chronology were set aside as pseudo-history. In effect, the world's story was re-edited under the language of rational progress. Even explorers who had witnessed anomalies saw their reports buried. In 1834, British officer Charles Stoddart wrote from Bukhara describing ruins unlike any architecture of the Islamic or Chinese schools, with arches fused as if by heat. His dispatches to London went unanswered. He died 3 years later, executed as a spy. His surviving notes were published posthumously, stripped of their geographical detail. The editor's preface read, "His imaginative accounts may be disregarded." By the late 19th century, the term Tartaria survived only as an ethnographic curiosity. Textbooks mentioned the Tatar peoples, smaller groups within Russian and Mongol territories, but the Grand Empire once depicted on maps was redefined as myth. Meanwhile, industrialization reshaped memory. Railways, telegraphs, and the rapid spread of photography gave the illusion that history had just begun, that everything before was primitive. The architectural marvels standing in plain sight were attributed to sudden genius, to the flowering of European craft, and never to a forgotten source. Censorship need not have been deliberate to be effective. The coordination of education, printing, and government archives after 1850 ensured that only a unified narrative survived. The destruction of older material through fires, wars, and reclassification did the rest. The Library of Congress, for instance, lists thousands of early titles as lost in the fire of 1851. The Paris Library reported similar losses in 1871 during the Commune uprising. Among the missing were collections on Oriental antiquities and electrical phenomena before Volta. In 1889, Russian historian Alexander Yadrintsev made a remark that reads almost prophetic. "We have buried not only the dead, but their memory." He was referring to the unexplored ruins of Central Asia, which he believed to predate the Mongol invasions. His colleagues dismissed the statement as poetic excess. Today, his papers remain untranslated in the archives of Tomsk University. What disappeared in the 19th century was not merely a civilization's name, but an entire worldview. a way of seeing nature, energy, and architecture as parts of one system. When it was gone, history began anew, stripped of the threads that once connected sky to stone and builder to earth. The silence that followed was not empty, it was organized. The Great Fire pattern between 1810 and 1910, a strange rhythm of destruction repeated across the modernizing world. Cities burned, and when the smoke cleared, the streets were rebuilt with new geometry, wider boulevards, aligned grids, and architecture that erased whatever had stood before. Officially, these events were coincidences, accidents, lightning strikes, or carelessness in rapidly growing industrial centers. Yet the frequency, scale, and timing of these fires suggests something coordinated not necessarily by people, but by a larger process of erasure. It was as if the world was being cleared and redrawn under the same invisible directive. In 1812, Moscow caught fire as Napoleon's troops entered the city. Eyewitnesses described heat so intense that stone melted, and copper roofs ran like wax. The flames moved against the wind, consuming sections untouched by cannon fire. When rebuilding began, much of the older medieval masonry was replaced by neoclassical facades. The new city that emerged bore no resemblance to the one that had stood for centuries. Architects working under Tsar Alexander I were instructed to modernize and align, a phrase that quietly replaced restore. 3 decades later, in 1842, Hamburg burned for 3 days. Over 20,000 people were left homeless, and nearly the entire medieval centre was gone. Official reports blamed a cigar dropped in a warehouse, yet the fire's progression followed a grid-like path, sparing the outer fortifications and focusing on the old districts. When the city was rebuilt, the narrow, twisting lanes that had survived since the Hanseatic League were erased. Wide streets appeared where no roads had existed before. The same pattern unfolded across continents. In 1851, San Francisco burned 6 times in a single year. Each time, the city's temporary wooden structures were replaced by brick and iron materials imported, curiously, from distant suppliers who seemed ready before the flames had cooled. By 1871, the Great Chicago Fire repeated the cycle on a monumental scale. Newspapers spoke of fire tornadoes and streets glowing as if from beneath. The cause was attributed to a lantern kicked over in a barn, but scientists noted electrical disturbances in the sky the same night. Witnesses described red and green auroras over Lake Michigan, an atmospheric phenomenon rare at that latitude. Within 2 years, the Chicago World's Fair Planning Committee began surveying land for exposition grounds. The fair would display a vision of the future, dazzling architecture, electric light, and order. The ruins of the fire had cleared the stage for a new city, built in alignment with the global template emerging across Europe, Russia, and the Americas. The pattern continued. In 1889, Seattle burned. In 1904, Baltimore. In 1906, San Francisco again. In 1917, the Great Thessaloniki Fire consumed 2/3 of the city. Each blaze was followed not by restoration, but by redesign, under central commissions that appeared almost immediately after the catastrophe. Historians attribute these fires to urban density and wooden construction, but the destruction often spared newly built governmental or financial buildings. In Chicago, the post office and customs house survived untouched, while everything around them turned to ash. In Moscow, the Kremlin's stone walls withstood the inferno, while the surrounding city disintegrated. A curious selectivity flames that favoured renewal, not annihilation. Some contemporary observers sensed pattern where officials saw coincidence. The British architect Charles Barry wrote in 1854, "Each fire seems to cleanse, to level, and to prepare for the same design symmetry where disorder once lay." His remark, dismissed as philosophical musing, reads now like quiet observation. Similar words appear in the journals of Danish engineer Johan Müller, who helped rebuild Copenhagen after the fire of 1795. It is as though the hand that writes has chosen to erase and begin again. If Tartaria truly existed, a civilization whose structures predated modern nations, then these fires may have been its final undoing. The mud floods buried what remained below, and the fires consumed what still stood above. In the ashes, a uniform world emerged. Neoclassical facades, rational grids, and the new aesthetic of progress. A reset by flame, evidence of unusual combustion, accompanies many of these events. In the 1872 Boston fire, witnesses reported granite blocks cracking under heat. In 1886, Charleston's post-fire investigation described melted window glass pooled in perfect circles, as though exposed to temperatures higher than any known building fire could produce. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, where a fire killed thousands the same night as Chicago's, trees were described as exploding into vapor. Some meteorologists linked these to atmospheric electricity, perhaps intensified solar activity. Others ignored the connection. The aftermath of these disasters always followed the same administrative pattern: immediate establishment of reconstruction boards, introduction of modern building codes, and strict new property laws. In some cases, entire populations were relocated. Thessaloniki's 1917 reconstruction plan was drafted before the ashes cooled, designed by French architects who had never seen the original city. In their blueprints, Ottoman domes and Byzantine arcs were replaced with rectangular grids. Old photographs show workers digging through layers of brick and stone buildings older than recorded history before paving them over. The speed of reconstruction hints at prior planning. In Chicago, contracts for new iron beams were signed less than a week after the fire. In San Francisco, architects had pre-drafted urban plans long before the 1906 quake. The term urban renewal did not yet exist, but the process already did. Catastrophe as the instrument of reorganization. In the following decades, as modern industry rose from these ashes, a sense of discontinuity settled into collective memory. People spoke of before the fire and after the fire, as though two worlds had existed. The first wooden, ornate, archaic, was gone. The second iron, standardized, mechanical, was all that remained. Fires became thresholds between epochs, convenient dividing lines that ended questions about what had been lost. A Russian proverb from the period captures this silence. Ashes hide what words cannot. The global rebuild, from the 1,850 seconds onward, the rebuilding of cities after fire, flood, and war, followed an uncanny uniformity. Across continents, Europe, Asia, the Americas, even colonies, newly formed urban landscapes began to take the same form. Wide boulevards cutting through once narrow quarters, domed government halls, massive train stations with identical iron frameworks, and public buildings dressed in the same neoclassical style. The repetition of design was so complete that an observer standing in Paris street, Petersburg, or Buenos Aires might see the same facades, the same arches, even the same statues. It was as if the world had received a single architectural template and rebuilt itself in obedience to a common plan. After the fires, reconstruction commissions appeared with immediate precision. In Paris, Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann began his vast redesign in 1853, clearing medieval neighbourhoods and replacing them with straight avenues, gas lamps, and monumental squares. The project continued under Napoleon III for 17 years, covering more than 60% of the city. Officially, it was modernization, sanitation, air circulation, order. Yet the timing coincides with similar transformations in cities far removed from France. In St. Petersburg, following the great floods of 1824 and again in 1859, imperial architects rebuilt vast sections of the city, replacing Baroque irregularities with perfect alignments. The new facades were executed in pale stone, symmetrical, and strictly proportioned according to the Petersburg classicism that mirrored Haussmann's later reforms. In London, after the 1848 and 1861 fires, entire boroughs were replanned with wider streets and uniform terraces. Even Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco new cities, by comparison, were rebuilt with the same features. Grand civic centers, Greco-Roman columns, domed courthouses, and endless rows of stone-fronted offices. What linked these cities was not trade or empire, but a hidden synchronization. Architectural blueprints traveled faster than ships. Design books appeared simultaneously in multiple languages. The Pattern Book of Civic Design, published anonymously in 1872, contained detailed drawings of buildings from around the world, identical in scale and dimension. Its diagrams of column ratios and dome curvature reappear almost unchanged in municipal archives from Spain, India, and Argentina. The author was never identified, and copies of the first edition have vanished from libraries. Officially, these similarities are credited to the global spread of the Beaux-Arts movement. Yet Beaux-Arts itself emerged fully formed, without a clear developmental path. Its principal symmetry, axial alignment, monumental facades resemble the geometry of older Tartarian star forts and energy structures. The academies of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg that taught it all adopted the same curriculum within a decade, using the same measurements. The precision hints at inheritance, not invention. Electric infrastructure followed the same pattern. The earliest power grids in London, Berlin, and New York were laid out according to standardized block systems cables beneath every major avenue, lamps at fixed intervals. By the 1880 seconds, when Edison's and Tesla's systems began competing, the streets were already prepared for wiring. In some cases, conduits were found below the new pavements, made of ceramic tubes far older than the cables themselves. Engineers noted their presence but seldom questioned their origin. Railway stations were built like cathedrals, often before the cities had significant train networks. The Gare du Nord in Paris, 1864, Street, Pancras in London, 1868, and Union Station in Washington, 1907, all share the same arched geometry and decorative iron ribs. Their architects cited inspiration from ancient monumental principles. Some of these iron frames were cast in foundries that left no record of their origin. Reconstruction also standardized measurement. The metric system, introduced officially in 1799, but only widely adopted after 1850, aligned perfectly with the needs of global architecture. Masonry sizes, column heights, and street widths were recalculated in whole meters and tens of meters, replacing older local units. The new consistency made replication easy. Builders from different continents could now follow identical plans, but the convenience also erased traces of older proportions, many based on harmonic or astronomical ratios no longer used. Certain civic structures appear in nearly every rebuilt city: the triumphal arch, the central dome, and the obelisk. Between 1880 and 1910, over 40 new obelisks were erected worldwide, often in places without Egyptian heritage. In Washington, the monument was completed in 1884. In Paris, the Luxor obelisk had been reinstalled decades earlier. Buenos Aires raised its own in 1936 on the same coordinates. These pillars, perfectly conductive stone shafts, mirror earlier antenna structures described in Tartarian law. The rebuilding also introduced underground networks, sewers, tunnels, and basements, aligned with mathematical precision. Engineers remarked that excavation often revealed old vaulted passages ready for reuse. In New York, the first subway tunnels in 1900 followed existing depressions in the ground. In Paris, Haussmann's sewer system mapped directly onto older catacombs. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate adaptation, the effect was identical. The old world buried, the new world built upon its bones. Even decorative details followed global order. The same cast-iron lampposts appear in photographs from Moscow, Madrid, and Manila. The same carved lions guard bridges in Budapest and Tokyo. The same fountain basins, octagonal with concentric tiers, emerge in parks built by planners who had never met. These were not copied one by one. They came from a shared catalogue of forms, a manual that no one claims to have written. After each city's transformation, archives were revised. Pre-fire maps disappeared, replaced by official reconstructions. Buildings dated from 1850 onward were called New Classical, while identical structures predating that date were labelled Ancient. The arbitrary division created the illusion of continuous progress. The sense that humanity had evolved naturally from simplicity to complexity became a cornerstone of modern history. But the uniformity of the rebuild suggests something else, an inherited system of design principles transmitted without name, language, or acknowledgement. A blueprint rediscovered after the fires, quietly applied to every continent, until the whole world reflected one architecture, one order, one memory, rewritten in stone. By the early 20th century, the transformation was complete. The world appeared modern, rational, industrial. The traces of the old civilization, whatever it was, had been absorbed into the foundations of the new, and the silence around its memory grew thicker with every brick laid. The great silence. When the rebuilding ended, the world grew quiet. The ruins had been cleared, the fires extinguished, the streets straightened. Yet the silence that followed was not the calm of completion. It was a silence that settled like a curtain drawn between memory and record. Sometime around the early 20th century, the idea of Tartaria, of lost empires, and of technologies that drew energy from the air simply ceased to exist within public knowledge. What had once appeared in atlases, academic journals, and travel accounts vanished from libraries, schools, and conversation. The change did not arrive with censorship, but with consensus and new agreement about what the past had been. In the universities of Europe, the structure of education itself was rewritten. History, once a vast discipline of comparative chronologies, was divided into smaller fields: archaeology, anthropology, and geology. Each specialized, each isolated. The connections between them: architecture, aligned with magnetic fields; myth describing measurable energy; maps reflecting celestial geometry, were declared speculative and removed from study. A German educational reform in 1898 established that only empirical and verifiable records would count as historical evidence. The effect was decisive. Anything that lacked a clear author, date, or purpose was deemed irrelevant. Within a generation, the memory of a global, pre-industrial civilization was reduced to folklore. The silence extended beyond academia. In 1905, the Royal Geographic Society ordered the withdrawal of its oldest world maps for correction and standardization. These maps, some of which still bore the name Tartaria, were replaced with new editions showing the familiar borders of Russia, China, and Mongolia. The originals were archived and later dispersed to private collections. In St. Petersburg, the Imperial Academy of Sciences issued a similar decree. Cartographic materials predating 1820 were moved to a restricted vault, catalogued as obsolete. Public copies were destroyed during the revolution that followed. In literature, the shift was equally abrupt. Before 1850, popular travelogues spoke freely of unexplored empires and northern kingdoms. By 1900, the imagination of writers turned inward to individual consciousness, to cities of iron and smoke. Jules Verne's early novels contain passing references to the ruins of ancient Siberia, yet later editions omit them. The English translations of his work, published by Sampson Low and Marston, quietly removed such phrases. Even encyclopedias of the early 20th century, those vast repositories of modern knowledge, display a gap. The 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica, considered a triumph of rational science, includes no mention of Tartaria, not even as an archaic term. Technology became detached from its prehistory. The generation that grew up under electric light and steam assumed they had invented it. The ornate domes and spires that once gathered energy were now reinterpreted as symbols of religion or empire. In public lectures, scientists avoided discussing atmospheric electricity outside of meteorology. Nikola Tesla's experiments, once seen as the bridge between old and new, were dismissed as eccentric. When he died in 1943, the FBI confiscated his notes and sealed them for national security. The details of his Wardenclyffe Tower, its grounding system, its copper dome, its resonance principles resembled too closely the forgotten designs of Tartarian architecture. The resemblance was never acknowledged. Museums reinforced the new silence through reclassification. Artifacts once displayed as examples of unknown engineering bronze spheres, iron gears, alloyed pipes were moved to miscellaneous collections or retagged as modern reproductions. The Smithsonian, founded in 1846, absorbed vast quantities of archaeological material from Siberia, Central Asia, and the American West. Early curators spoke of advanced ruins, precise metallurgy, and anomalous proportions. By 1900, those same curators or their successors redefined the finds as natural formations or frontier artifacts. The descriptions changed, the objects did not. By the mid-20th century, a new kind of memory had taken hold, mechanical, linear, and unquestioned. School books presented a simple progression: cave dwellers, ancient empires, Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, industry, modernity. Every people fit somewhere inside that ladder, each with a clear beginning and end. The vast gaps between them, the lost centuries, the unexplained leaps in construction or technology, were dismissed as accidents of history. Children learned dates, not mysteries. The concept of a global reset was no longer even imaginable. What kept the silence intact was not suppression, but repetition. Every university, every museum, every press used the same sources, often translated from the same few European languages. When alternative narratives emerged suggesting cyclic catastrophes or forgotten sciences, they were labelled pseudoscience. The label itself became a barrier stronger than censorship. To question the sequence of progress was to step outside the profession, to leave history for myth. In architecture, the last visible traces of the old world faded behind new materials. Concrete replaced stone. The dome, once a receiver, became an ornament. By the 1932, glass and steel dominated skylines, built for efficiency, not resonance. The global rebuild was complete. The memory of what came before had been folded into design, stripped of meaning. The surviving examples, Street Isaacs, the Capitol, the Paris Opera, were admired as art, not technology. A handful of scholars tried to reopen the question. In 1921, a Russian historian named Alexei Lozev published a small volume titled On the Geometry of Memory, arguing that many classical ratios were inherited, not invented. his work was banned. In 1947, an Italian engineer, Carlo Matteucci, demonstrated that certain domed chambers amplified atmospheric electricity. His paper was quietly withdrawn. In both cases, their discoveries echoed principles already used in the forgotten architecture of Tartaria resonance, proportion, harmonic conduction. By the second half of the century, even the ruins themselves began to vanish. Wars, redevelopment, and urban expansion buried the remaining structures under asphalt and concrete. Old tunnels were sealed, foundations were filled. A civilization once visible in plain sight was entombed again, this time beneath modernity itself. Today, the silence continues, but it is thinner. Digital archives and satellite imagery have begun to reveal the same repeating geometry once dismissed as coincidence. Star forts reappear on every continent. Submerged streets align with present-day grids. Photographs of 19th century construction sites show what official records ignore: doorways, half buried, columns rising from mud. And the domes, though stripped of their purpose, still stand, catching the same light they once gathered. History does not erase, it overlays. Each generation writes its own layer, compressing what came before into the foundation. Somewhere beneath our feet, under every city rebuilt in the 19th century, the earlier world still waits in darkness, sealed not by soil alone, but by silence. Echoes of the old world. Even within the silence, faint traces remained, scattered among modern cities, embedded in their walls, and hidden behind their facades are fragments that seem to remember something older: shapes, sounds, and materials that do not belong to the age credited with their creation. The world that replaced Tartaria, for all its order and standardization, could not erase every detail. Beneath the new layers, the old world continues to speak, quietly, through what endures. The first clues appear in architecture. The pattern of domes, arches, and spires that once defined the forgotten empire persists in structures built long after its supposed disappearance. Many civic buildings from the late 19th century, courthouses, museums, train stations, retain the same proportions used in Tartarian cathedrals and towers. Their windows curve with mathematical precision. Their pillars rise in Fibonacci intervals. Most curious are the recurring measurements. Doorways of exactly 2.1 meters, ceilings rising in multiples of 3.3, courtyards that align to solstices and magnetic north. These proportions, consistent across continents, suggest that architects worked from templates older than their own traditions. In music, too, faint echoes survive. The church organs of the 1800s, often installed in buildings suspected of older foundations, use resonant chambers that correspond to architectural domes above them. When certain frequencies are played, the vibrations align perfectly with the curvature of the roof, amplifying sound far beyond what their size should allow. Modern acousticians describe this as coincidence, but it follows a precise rule: a harmonic ratio of 1 to 1.62, the same golden proportion observed in Tartarian layouts. These are not random harmonies. They are physical remnants of a knowledge that linked sound and structure as parts of the same design. In older symbols, the continuity becomes even clearer. Across official seals and decorative friezes from the late 19th century appear motifs of suns, wings, and orbs held by towers identical to depictions once labelled Tartarian emblems. A recurring image shows a sphere atop a spire flanked by laurel wreaths, sometimes mistaken for religious ornament. The same symbol appears on early electrical diagrams as the mark for a charge terminal. It is as if the memory of atmospheric energy, stripped of its function, survived as art. Artifacts found in unlikely places reinforce the link. In 1928, during renovations beneath Warsaw's Saxon Palace, workers discovered a set of bronze discs engraved with spiral patterns, The metal composition contained alloys not used since the 18th century, yet the spirals matched later depictions of electromagnetic flow. In 1935, near Tashkent, archaeologists unearthed a block of fused quartz carved into geometric channels, too precise for hand tools of its supposed era. The report, published briefly in Soviet archaeology, was withdrawn and archived under unclassified geomaterials. Even industrial design bears the imprint. Early electrical transformers, telegraph insulators, and lamp housings share identical shapes with ornaments found atop ancient domes. The glass bulbs of the first electric streetlights mirror the onion domes of old cathedrals, suggesting the continuity of a form long before its purpose was rediscovered. The inventor Hermann Plausen, who patented a method for harvesting atmospheric electricity in 1903, wrote that his design was inspired by the structures of our ancestors, who knew more than they revealed. His remark was omitted from later reprints. In forgotten corners of Europe and Asia, entire structures still stand that defy the linear timeline of architecture. The derelict observatories of Samarkand and Tobolsk, their domes built of copper and stone, show no signs of weathering consistent with their recorded age. Their orientation matches celestial coordinates, accurate to within 1 degree precision, difficult to achieve without modern instruments. In 1899, the astronomer Otto Struve examined the Tobolsk observatory and noted, "The foundation is older than the rest, of such quality that our tools dull against it." He made no further mention of it. Local traditions sometimes preserve what official history forgets. In Mongolia's northern provinces, villagers speak of singing towers, ruins that hum before thunderstorms. Shepherds claim the sound comes from metal hidden inside the walls. In Poland, farmers who plough near old star fort sites report compasses spinning wildly. And in parts of Turkey, minaret stones still carry a faint metallic sheen when struck by lightning, glowing blue for several seconds before fading. These are small fragments of a greater pattern, phenomena that modern explanation reduces to coincidence, but that together suggest resonance with a technology no longer understood. Cultural memory holds its own fragments. Folk songs from Russia's Volga region mention cities beneath the ground and lights that burned without fire. In Hungary, a 17th century hymn refers to towers that drank from heaven. The same phrase reappears centuries later, reworded in poetry, its meaning forgotten, but its rhythm intact. Even in languages separated by continents, words describing brilliance, current, and air share a common root. The Sanskrit tar and the Latin Tartarus both imply motion through the ether or flow from above. Perhaps the empire's name itself was not territorial, but descriptive, a civilization defined by its mastery of movement through the unseen. By the 20th century, these echoes had been scattered and disguised. The surviving technologies became myths of divine power, the surviving cities became tourist monuments, and the surviving knowledge was folded into art and religion. Yet the consistency remains too exact to be accidental. Star forts, cathedral domes, observatory towers, and even early power stations all share the same underlying geometry circles within squares, aligned to the cardinal directions, crowned with a central spire. Whether for defense, faith, or energy, the shape persisted because it worked. When seen from above, the pattern re-emerges. Satellite imagery shows ancient fortresses, colonial capitals, and 19th century city plans arranged on geometric grids that stretch across continents. The same alignments appear in distant places: Lisbon, Manila, Kolkata, New Orleans. The angles, ratios, and proportions echo each other like chords in a forgotten song. No official record connects them, but the geometry does not lie. It is the quiet continuity of design across centuries, surviving every flood and fire. The old world did not vanish. It was absorbed, disguised, and reinterpreted through the builders who came after. The echoes persist in stone, in sound, and in light. They wait in the curvature of every dome, in the vibration of every bell tower, and in the whisper of current that passes unnoticed through the air above every city rebuilt in its image. The return of memory. By the dawn of the 21st century, the silence that had wrapped the world for more than a century began to unravel. The walls that once held the archives of history no longer guarded their contents alone. Scanned pages, forgotten engravings, and grainy photographs migrated into the digital realm, shared across screens that could reach every corner of the world. What had been erased in print reappeared in pixels' half-buried doorways, forgotten blueprints, and maps still bearing a name that no modern textbook acknowledged: Tartaria. At first, the fragments seemed random. An 1,850 photograph of a cathedral in St. Petersburg revealed windows below street level. A crumbling star-shaped fort in India matched the layout of one in the Netherlands, though no shared builder existed. An engineer's notebook, dated 1893, described metallic veins running beneath a plaza in Paris. To those trained to see only progress, they were coincidences. But to others, they formed a map, faint, incomplete, yet recognizable. The same geometry, the same proportions, the same quiet precision that had once defined an empire, said to have vanished. In 2009, restoration workers in Kazan uncovered a copper conduit sealed beneath the old observatory. The pipes, capped with crystalline glass, ran in exact alignment with the building's dome above. Their surfaces showed no corrosion, as if crafted from an alloy unknown to modern metallurgy. A short note in the project report listed them as ventilation. The entry was never updated. In 2014, during an urban survey in Lisbon, ground-penetrating radar revealed octagonal foundations buried under the Praça do Comércio, identical in proportion to the Star Fort of Palmanova. And in 2017, engineers repairing the Hermitage Museum found slender iron rods embedded within its golden dome, still faintly magnetic after 2 centuries. No document mentioned their installation. The findings never reached public record, but they circulated quietly online fragments of an older design, surfacing again in the age of information. As these images spread, a new awareness formed. The same forms that defined the cathedrals, capitals, and museums of the modern age, the domes, arches, and towers, admired as symbols of the industrial century, shared exact ratios with structures far older. Their symmetry was too perfect, their orientation too deliberate to be accidental. Across continents, buildings erected decades apart aligned to the same celestial coordinates and magnetic fields. Whether by inheritance or imitation, the world had rebuilt itself according to the blueprints of something it no longer remembered. Tartaria, once dismissed as a cartographer's mistake, returned not as a nation but as an idea. That humanity's past might have been cyclical, that civilizations could fall and rise while leaving their outlines beneath new layers of stone. In this interpretation, the forgotten empire was not destroyed by time, but absorbed into modernity. Its knowledge had been disguised as ornament, its machines mistaken for art, its science retold as myth. The world had not lost Tartaria, it had simply learned to call it by other names. Even science, in its most modern language, began to echo the same principles that once described the empire's lost technology. Where Tartarian manuscripts spoke of ether, physics now speaks of the quantum field. Where they described resonance, engineers study frequency synchronization. And where ancient builders shaped domes to channel energy, modern laboratories build resonant chambers for electromagnetic confinement. The same forces, rephrased in new symbols, still pulse through the world. Discovery had circled back to what memory once knew. Architecture revealed the continuity most clearly. Restorers found, that many grand civic buildings of the 1800s, officially labelled neoclassical, were built atop much older foundations. The domes of Istanbul, Rome, and St. Petersburg share curvature within a margin of less than 1%. The United States Capitol and St. Paul's in London stand precisely aligned with magnetic north. Their interiors produce measurable electromagnetic anomalies, faint, rhythmic pulses detectable by modern instruments. Scientists attribute them to natural static, but the domes still hum when lightning strikes nearby, just as the older chronicles said the towers of Tartaria once did. The same geometry survives in music and sound. Cathedral organs built in the 18th and 19th centuries produce harmonics that match the curvature of the domes above them. The frequencies resonate with the architectural dimensions, amplifying tone and vibration as if each structure were both instrument and amplifier. To listeners, it is sacred acoustics. To the builders who first designed it, it may have been a science of resonance, the language of vibration turned into architecture. The fragments extend beyond stone. Symbols of the old world persist quietly within modern emblems, the sphere atop a spire, the winged disk, the radiant star. Once they may have marked energy conduits or astronomical alignments, now they decorate monuments and company logos, stripped of context but not of pattern. Even our modern technology carries faint traces of the same geometry. The glass bulbs of early street lamps mimic the onion domes of vanished cathedrals, and broadcast towers replicate the spired silhouette of ancient temples. The lineage survives not through continuity of name, but through repetition of form. The rediscovery of these patterns has less to do with belief than with recognition. The details that once seemed decorative spirals, lattices, ratios, prove to be the same mathematical relationships that govern light, sound, and magnetism. What older builders carved into stone, modern engineers measure in wave equations. The two describe the same truth with different languages. To some, the reappearance of Tartaria's memory suggests that history itself operates like resonance, each era vibrating faintly with the frequency of the one before it. What vanishes does not disappear, it echoes, waiting to be heard when the world again attunes to its tone. The pattern of rediscovery, the cycle of suppression, and return mirrors the rhythm of the architecture itself. Repetition within variation, order beneath change. The story's ending is not revelation, but reflection. Every civilization builds upon ruins. Every invention recalls something forgotten. The steam engine echoes the furnace, the radio recalls the bell tower, and the skyscraper repeats the geometry of the spire. What we call progress may simply be the resurfacing of knowledge buried beneath centuries of soil and soot. In this sense, Tartaria never needed to rise again. Its principles are woven into the foundations of our cities, our sciences, and our thought. The digital age has made this visible once more. Through photographs, open archives, and satellite imagery, the pattern of the old world is reassembling itself piece by piece. Star forts appear on coastlines once considered remote. Subterranean chambers align with modern grids. The architecture of a forgotten civilization still shapes the daily rhythm of life above it. History records events, memory records design. The stones of the present still carry the ratios of the past, the hum of proportion that cannot be fully silenced. The fires, floods, and reconstructions that once sought to erase that rhythm merely pressed it deeper into the layers of time. Now, as light returns to the hidden maps, as the lost names reappear on screens and lips, the silence weakens. The towers still stand, the energy still moves, the patterns still connect one continent to another, one century to the next. Whether the empire called Tartaria was ever ruled by kings or simply by knowledge, its presence endures in geometry, in sound, and in the quiet precision of what still works long after its makers have vanished. Perhaps the forgotten civilization never ended. Perhaps it only changed its name and waited. Every dome, every arch, every hum beneath the stone is a reminder that erasure is never complete. Memory always finds a way back. And when it returns, it does not shout, it resonates, softly, through the air, through the current, through the architecture of the living world, until the silence that once covered everything begins, slowly, to listen again. The world we know may only be the latest layer of a far older design. The streets, domes, and towers that surround us carry silent equations from a forgotten age, their purpose disguised as ornament, their meaning reduced to myth. Perhaps what we call progress is only remembrance, patterns resurfacing when the time is right. The traces of Tartaria remind us that history is never complete. It shifts, it hides, and sometimes it returns through the smallest details. If the echoes of the old world still whisper through our cities, what else waits beneath our feet or within our own memory? Join us again as we travel deeper into the forgotten chapters of history, one layer at a time. Subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past, where silence still remembers.